Well, I have the honor to present Dr. Patrick Galès. He is a researcher, professor of sociology of politics at Sciences Po, Center for European Studies in Comparative Policies, and he's chair of Cities Are Back in Town and Restructuring the State. Dr. Galès is fellow of the British Academy and former president of the Society of Advanced Socioeconomics, and he has been visitor professor of many universities, such as UCLA, King's College, Max Planck Institute, University of Sao Paulo, Colegio de México, among others. Galès was elected member of the Academic European in July 2019, and he won various awards, such as Stein-Rocan Prize, the Award of Excellence Research in Policy Science from the French Political Science Association Foundation, among others. His research deals with comparative public policy, policy instruments, and the political sociology of the state, urban sociology, urban political economy in large metropolis, such as Sao Paulo, Paris, Mexico, and London. And he also studies economic sociology, political economy, and the making of a market and the sociology of Europe, with a special interest in the UK and the financialization of housing and the red state. Patrick does not come from the educational field, and that makes it especially enriching his participation in this conference. His work helps us, those who we do work in educational field, to think about the power constitution in policy instruments like PISA, teachers' assessment, national testing, among others. His work also helps us to think about what explains the international spread of a new wave of governance instruments in public administration, and what can educational policy research borrow from recent development of policy instruments, theory, and research. His presentation now is titled The Constitution, Power of Policy Instruments. So many thanks. We leave, so Patrick can do his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to give this keynote this morning. Thanks, Tony, for suggesting that, although being ignorant in terms of education, I'm not ignorant. I'm a colleague of Agnès van Zanten, so I read a lot of her work. So everything I know is from Agnès. And thanks for your generous introduction. After such an introduction, of course, you'll be disappointed because I would never leave to what was said there. What I want to do this morning is to start by emphasizing a number of issues, and emphasizing that when you think about policy instruments, so some of my work in public policy has been to work on policy instruments, which has become a bit buzzword. But I do other things, and I must tell you immediately that sometimes policy instruments do not matter very much. It's not always the case, okay? So number one, we're not here to promote an instrument at school, but sometimes it thanks. But the starting point is really to emphasize that when you think about instruments, the first point is to realize that what you want to do is to think in relation to what is going on in the way you exercise political authority. So I'm part of those people who are not doing public administration. I want to think about instruments as a way to exercise authority on strange people, inhabitants, citizens, who are more and more strange, number one. And second, to make the link with the transformation of a state. So, and other level of authority. So my interest in public policy is not to look for best recipe. In my schools at Sciences Po, it's forbidden to say best practice. Okay, if you don't say best practice you're sacked. Okay, just doesn't make any sense at all from my point of view. And it's a very important part, of course, in education, because you know better than I that historically the making of a modern state was connected to thinking about education and to train citizens. And in many ways, the policies about education in the UK after 1830, in France in the 19th century, were at the heart of making the modern state. So for me, this is this connection which makes sense, and instruments is one way to think along those lines. But of course, for me, education is just one policy among others. I know you are very spicy. I do also urban thing. Urban people think they are the center of the world, don't worry. So we all do that. But what I will say is to connect in those words. Point 2, let me start by 2 examples of what I want to say. And you realize that I'm not going to follow the ambitious title that Tony gave me because it was too ambitious. I could not deal with that, so I did something else. But closely connected. Point 1, think about what happened during the COVID. It was so spectacular to see at the same time, a lot of attempt to invent all range of new ways of doing things, innovation of instruments, great for connoisseurs, really interesting. We saw a lot of centralization in the different countries, like mine, a lot of bit of decentralization, chaos in most places. You see all these multi-level things going on and innovation here and there. People, countries at the same time saying, we are in France, COVID will not happen, it's only Italy, it will never happen, And of course the UK said, no, it's only France and Europe, it will never happen to the UK. So you saw this mix of trying to be national and completely interdependent in what happened, but also then in trying to find solutions, and then in the way you organize some of the provision of masks or whatever you wanted to, and the complete chaos in the production of knowledge. And it was very hard for policy experts to say, because of the knowledge we have, we can tell you that's what should be done in face of COVID. So what is interesting also in this episode was to emphasize all these dimensions that you see in education, but also this idea about knowledge and the parallelation about to what extent the knowledge was allowed to justify a number of policies. In France, it was fantastic. At some point, the Prime Minister said, because of the knowledge we have, we know that masks are completely useless and we should not do anything about that. And then, according to the knowledge we have, it's a bit different, and we have the different policy instruments and recommendations. Or some policies based on zero knowledge. Lockdown, that was like, we have no idea what to do, so let's do lockdown, why not? It could help. So I want to emphasize this very chaotic world and not structured world in policy instruments. The second thing I want to emphasize is a news that you're probably aware of, but for me it was fantastic to see that Chinese universities, or some of them, including Renmin and some prestigious one, are not going to follow the Shanghai ranking anymore. And if I understand correctly, and that's my other colleague, Christine Musselin, on higher education, which is my source, a number of Xi Jinping is telling that Chinese universities should follow their own way and should stop follow the Shanghai ranking. What a shock for French policymakers. They justify a number of reform and fusion of university in order to be better ranked in the Shanghai. And now the Chinese are not even following the Shanghai ranking. Where do we go? So I want to emphasize what Rita has been saying in the beginning. We are not looking, when we think about various policy instruments, at some linear view or just some convergence. We have to understand much more chaotic process. But I will try to give in my talk the idea that I want to go beyond the society of science view of the extremely constructivist and things change all the time. The all work for us is to find ways to understand some of those trajectories, at least in some probabilistic terms. So I will not come back to why bother about policy instruments. I think the story has been told many times. We have published a lot about that. Just for those who don't remember, the all interest in those things is really because, in my world, I know education is very different. When I look at a number of policies, I see failures, policies that do not follow the goals, or very strange creation. So the idea that sometimes some policies lead to results that you expect, it's the exception, it's not the rule, okay? So that's a starting point, and I will make some criticism later on some of my colleagues on that, but it's our part of things. So I'm very much on the line of Christopher Hood, the great scholar of public policy in Oxford, who's done a lot of work on blame game. Remember that one of the main problems of politicians nowadays and policymakers is that there's so much out there, and they know that they are under pressure to be judged on the output. Fritz Sharp called about output legitimation of politics and not input through the election. So they know they have to deliver some things which is visible for their voters. And on the other end, they are more and more aware of the complexity of the machinery of government. So it's more and more unlikely that they're going to succeed to be elected on a policy and to implement it. So they face tremendous pressure. And I think you have to keep that in mind as a key element in any policy domain. This blame game, avoiding blame, is a major element of what is going on in terms of our policies. So already I'm telling you things about symbolic policies. I'm sort of undermining the classic rational view. And I think it's a core. And that's what we saw in our empirical work with my colleague Pierre Lascaux. That was obvious in environment issues, in urban, in housing, a number of policies. We know that historically, people like Lindblom has mentioned this issue of techniques of government. And for me, the key source for those who want to go further is an old work by Renate Mainz, the great lady of public policy in Europe from the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. She's still working, 90 years old. She's still publishing excellent papers. Gosh. And she made a very important point that I want you to keep in mind because I think it makes sense today. She wrote a paper in 93, but the paper came from the 1980s and the 70s. And she said, Germany is in trouble. The Germans like to say Germany is in trouble. The rest of Europe thinks they're doing very well, but, it's part of a thing. Germany is in trouble. And she said, Germany is in trouble because we cannot deliver policies anymore. We cannot deliver policies because think about the 1970s. You have all these young people who were alternative, who were in squats, they were doing all these things. So how do you govern people who do not respect the classic basic of citizenship? And the German elite were very worried. And people refused to do military service, did not respect the police, were doing sort of vegetarian food, all these sort of strange things. So she was making the point that how you govern those people who are not exactly like what you expect. Of course, she was wrong. 10 years later, they bought an Audi car, they had a house, a garden, most of them, so it was okay. But there's this issue of, which I keep in mind, this issue, and that's why we do a political sociology of instruments. Governance is a relation between those who govern and those who are governed. So that's why so much, in my view, public administration or public policy work is useless in many ways. They do not think about who is in front of them, who is governed. And of course, a lot of policies, you can explain the failure because people have no ideas about who is governed. To mock my own country, for many years we trained our top civil servants in a very effective way to tell them they were the best civil servant in the world, and they had no idea about what's going on in the French society. Well, I must say, when I was in Oxford, it was the same thing for British elite. But in Italy, they didn't say that, but it was a different story. So the second, they had some problems with trade unions and corporatism. So there was this idea that classic way to govern were becoming ineffective, didn't work. They were not able to deliver the goods in terms of implementation of policies. And I think what at the core, so thinking about policy instruments is thinking about how you exercise authority, how you govern, how you find forms of collective action. For me, public policy is a form of collective action with some political element, and how you manage to change society you are in and to organize some of the society. So this is what was the basics of our thinking on these issues. And of course, with my colleagues, we use a lot of Foucault and dispositif and all the thinking of Foucault, the rationality of government, governmentality, and emphasizing on the activities of government. When you look at public policy, some people focus on actors, they're right, it's important, or trajectory of actors, fine. But as we said before, we have to think about the processes are very important. But for me, in terms of method, what I learned from the work we do is you have to focus on activities. What do people do? What is going on? What sort of activities are done? And sometimes those activities are linked to actors, but not always. Sometimes it's connected to institutions. Sometimes you see the processes. But looking at what is going on, at activities, for me, is a method, a lesson coming from some of the work of Foucault. I have to say I'm not an expert on Foucault. My colleague Pierre Lascaux is a super expert on Foucault. So that's from him. So I know nothing. I just learn with my colleagues. And of course, when you think about policies and the state, you have to think about the machinery of government, as Weber used to say. You have to think about the way things work and the bureaucracy and all the nitty-gritty details. And that's the combination that led us to develop the programs and policy instruments that we said. Again, many policy failures. In the policies I've been studying and in a number of work we've been doing in my center at Sciences Po, what was striking was the importance of especially in French, you'll be like, a lot of people are trained by philosophy, so especially sociologists. So they like ideas, ideas because that's what they're good at, okay? So they really emphasize always the importance of ideas. And ideas matter, of course, sometimes, not always, sometimes. But they don't like interest groups that American public policy, just not so nice. We think about the French state, we do public policy in a much more noble way. But in the world we were studying, it was striking to see that, number one, lots of the goals were never achieved, okay? All the reforms of education in France over the last 30 years were about decreasing inequalities in education. Not a great success, shall we say? And second, people did not even pretend. One of the results of our research was to show that in a number of major law and major policies, it's not that there was no goals, it was that there were too many goals. I studied some big law, and we look at how many goals. So when you start a big law, and over UK same thing, because I've learned that as well, you start by saying, number one, this new policy, this new law will save the world. I mean, we'll do something about the climate crisis one way or another, and sustainable development. Second, of course, it will do something about the competitiveness of a country. And thirdly, it will do something about solidarity and inclusiveness. That's the beginning, okay? And then you have sort of medium-sized law and then small ones. So when you look at the major law that were passed in France in the last 30 years, very often you find between 20 and 25 main goals, not then to precise the detail. What does it tell us? It tells us that because of the blame game I explained before, very often the real goals are defined during the implementation stage. And that's the logic of Chris Hood. Very often politicians think, it is so difficult, we're going to be taken accountable for this thing. And at the end of the day, they can say, oh, that was the goal, that was the most important one. That's the one that worked, okay? So I want to emphasize on this major uncertainty about the goal. You want to decrease inequality. Many countries have tried that. Success is minimum, shall we say, in a number of countries. So there's this discrepancy between the goals and the world of politics, where you have to say things to voters, which is incredibly separated from the world of policies and the way it is operating. So that's why in our world, we discovered that in a number of cases, nobody agrees on the goals. People didn't know what to do. And they could not do nothing. It's difficult to say, I am your minister and I do nothing. Politically, there's a role of doing things. You don't vote for politicians saying they will do nothing. So one way to solve in our domain was to see that very often we agreed on doing something around some policy instruments. Let's do something. Let's create an indicators. Let's do some assessment. Let's create a map. Let's create a plan. Let's do something, and then we'll see as we work what it will become, and we'll define the goal in the making. So it's nothing new, really. It's called implementation studies, but it's a way. And that's what we saw in a number of domains, where because of a lack of implementation and the lack of support or coalitions for a number of policies, the idea was a sort of Lindblom incrementalism new way. Let's start by doing things that look good. And, assessment of school teachers, children, you have no idea what it's supposed to produce afterwards, but it looks good. It makes it visible. Parents like that. We do something. We're doing school assessments. And then we'll see what happens. So, the whole point we were making was in a number of public policy, the instruments were more and more becoming the policies in some ways. Not always, of course, but quite systematically. And then there was this sort of, at the time when a lot of policies failed, there was even more proliferation of instruments. So that's why we designed this research program, and we discuss for that. So that was the puzzle. So I'll do three things quickly. Well, quickly, I still have some time. Number one, to say a few things about policy instruments and the state, and I want to emphasize this dimension today because I think education is a key element to understand and to think about the state. And most of state theorists don't do that. They just ignore, which is strange, if you remember Durkheim. Second, I'll say a few things about instruments, and I cannot do everything. So I just, in a little bit of a caricatural way, I will emphasize three ways to think about instruments that are more important nowadays in the debate: the political sociology that we are following, the STS work, which is extremely interesting, and briefly, I'll say something about the Michael Howlett group, but I think you'll have a counterpoison to Romano with Capano, so I will be briefly critical, but you have a counterpoison tomorrow, so you'll be fine. And then I will finish on the question of method, on how to work on those instruments and how you can work. And I'll say a few things about, if I have time, on my current research on housing in 3 countries. So, as was rightly said in the introduction, I think the sort of work you're doing, I think it's fascinating. That's why I was so pleased to read the papers that Tony sent me, because we are at a key moment where we see that this field of global comparative public policy is in the making. And it's not completely clear how it's going to be organized in some ways. Of course, as was rightly mentioned by Rita, the Stanford Group is telling us about the making of a world society, and they look at convergence and big trends, and that's interesting in some ways. A lot of people are telling us it's all chaotic anyway, so let's be hard constructivist and we'll see what happens. But we see, in fact, more than that. We see some institutions, and I think it's real time for a number of comparison, and I think it's a great time for comparative research. But imperfect comparison, because the unit of analysis are not separated anymore. So we have to have a lot of imagination about how we do comparison, comparing actors, processes, policies, result. We can compare all sorts of things at different level, which means that we have to be very rigorous. Or why do we do this comparison? To think about some research question. This is not a time to just keep national comparison and da-da-da-da. This just doesn't work at all in the public policy world. But that requires a lot of imagination and rigor and thinking about method in order to do that. So that will be my point. So very briefly, I'm using a book we did some time ago. When I read your papers about education policies, that reminds me what we do when we do some sociology of a state. In a very thick, extremely expensive book that we did some years ago with my colleague Desmond King at Oxford, we emphasize the transformation of a state. And I think it's important not to say what happens to the state explains what happened to policies. I am part of those people, and that was the conclusion of the book, who think that when you think about the state nowadays, you have to think about the policy state. That is a concept developed by Skowronek in the US, following Ted Loewy, meaning that what happens at the state level? Classically, people think about the state, and then you have public policies, and you change the institutions, and that will change the policies. Okay, that's a classic way a lot of people are thinking. What we are arguing with Skowronek and others, and my colleague Philippe Bezès in Paris, is that there are so many activities and so many policies at the state level that, in fact, the implementation of a number of policies not only structure politics, the sort of feedback effect in politics, the famous Ted Loewy policy defines politics element, which is one thing, but all these policies actually reorganizing the institutions of a state. Okay, so this is the logic that we have, which makes quite a change and makes the sort of work you do very important to understand some transformation of the state. And I encourage you to make those links and not to forget how you exercise political authority. And of course, you're familiar with the idea about, there was this whole idea of Michael Mann that societies were uncaged by warfare and the welfare state. This is not the case anymore. But what we see, and that's why I do sociology, that societies, more and more bits of societies is escaping the national level. And you know that in education. We see that more and more norms and standards and organizations are, of course, coming from the outside, but go to the citizen part. Bits of societies is being reorganized beyond the national level. And when I do research on upper middle class in Europe, I'm struck by the number of people telling me, what's the best education system in Europe? Should I move and educate my children in the UK? Or is the Swedish system really better? Is it true that Finland is so innovative? This is an obsession for all middle classes in Europe. So it's not just, thinking about the transformation of the state. It's just that the classic idea of nation state, and of course Spain is different because we have Catalans and all that, but you have to keep in mind that we have some social groups that are becoming either more localized. Scotland is more and more Scotland and is less and less the rest of the UK. But you also have more social groups that are organized one foot in their country and one foot somewhere else. We call that partial exit. And they combine and they have views of their system, and they put pressure on their system afterwards because they got some ideas from outside. Again, governance means who is governed is central in our thinking about those policy instruments. And of course, that states are part of what I want to emphasize is we try to, in this book, to emphasize with Des the idea that what was going on at the moment is the making of a state which is more transnational for all sorts of reasons that you know very well. Think about OECD, to put it bluntly, or large firms. It's a very capitalist state because we have lots of large firms, and you may have realized that capitalism has not completely disappeared. And they are policy state, meaning the policies are the central activities of what states are about, and they're part of the EU when they are European states. So I want to emphasize this thing. And the last thing I wanted to emphasize from this book for the instruments is we have classically viewed, including in education, the view of, in many states, more or less, the idea that what state elite do is try to unify their country and to mobilize different groups and territory and to try to. So the great scholar Gianfranco Poggi, who is an Italian Weberian sociologist, used to talk about the unifying energy of the state, which is a wonderful phrase, more or less. Okay, in the UK, the unifying energy of the state was not always strong for some of the northern peripheries and barbarians in Wales. I come from Brittany, so I care about the Celtic fringe. But it was obsessive, of course, in France. And we argue that in this world that we try to characterize, this element of unifying energy of the state is less important. And I think what we see in education is something about that. It has become not a central obsession to try to train all these people. And this question of education, that's what you mentioned, distance, you mentioned regulation to distance. It's part of this transformed role of the state. It is this new world is not completely obsessed by this unifying energy of the state. And you see this lovely cover of a book. I think it didn't help to sell the book, but you have to take risk. It's slightly different from the Leviathan, okay? It's a post-Leviathan conceptualization. But the idea is that, the state is this little thing there, and they operate and they are active beyond the frontiers, and they are in a world with lots of different things going on in different ways, and I think that's what we had. Okay, I don't want to emphasize too much, but this configuration of a state with contradictions, I think what happens in education is central to understand that. And what happens in other sectors is also applied. When I read some paper in education about assessment, outcome assessment, this is what we have seen in other sectors as well. So there's something there that we still need to characterize, which is not very clear. Remember the figures about public expenditure related to GDP. It was slowly declining in many European countries. And of course, the COVID has made it up. What happens next? Who knows? The point is, Europe is the part of the world with the highest part of public expenditure. So the world of public policy is in Europe. It's not in China, where these figures is about 20-25%. China is a hyper-capitalist country, as you probably know, and it's not in the US. Okay, we are doing far more public policies in many ways. So when we think public policy, I think we should sometimes less import ideas from the US and look much more at what happens in different countries. And these are the figures from OECD 2020. So France has the highest level of public expenditure in the world. We are a proper communist country in some ways. Not exactly, let's say socialist to some extent. And you see figures for Chile or Ireland are much lower. Again, public expenditure in relation to GDP. So this is really a big thing. So that's the public policy. So thinking about instruments for me is looking at there was a change of paradigm in the state. People looking at the grandiose conception of the state, and you look at the state in practice. Okay, the state doing things and the activities. That's why we do the instruments, and I've been saying that, so that's fine. And the logic that you see a lot in education, but maybe you should emphasize that even more, I think, sometimes, is this idea of denationalization of public policy. My colleague Philipp Genschel and Bernhard Zengel have done some great work about thinking in public policy about transnational public actors, about transnational firms, and transnational NGOs. And you see that the role of a state, you mentioned regulation to distance, is more to be a manager of public authority rather than having a quasi-monopoly. And I think what happens in education is exactly around those worlds. And that's why we have to change the way we think, and as you have done, think about circulation, knowledge, data, instruments, solutions, entrepreneurs, and trying to structure this field, which is completely not structured. So I think you have a very big impact to have on global policy model, comparative global public policy in the making, and the key word is comparative at different level. And I think what instruments help us to think is in those lines. Okay, that's enough. Second, on the instrument themselves. I will not come back on the details. is a long history of people doing work on policy instruments. The Canadians had a fantastic research program in the 70s and 80s with Michael Howlett, among others, that did some very strong work. Leslie Salomon, Lyndon and Peters. There were a lot of people doing work at different moments. And we saw all the things I've been mentioning. What is interesting is, at the same time, you have some people who have been thinking about that in different domains. So management studies, accounting studies, they have done a lot of work, more involved by Foucault, thinking about the instruments. And one of the things that, to go beyond our disciplines is to connect with some of this work in accounting that we try to do with accounting studies and management. So what I want to do now briefly, and it's a little bit schematic, but it helps to think, so who cares, is to emphasize 3 programs at the moment that are trying to develop thinking about instruments in different ways. Okay? So, of course, one is mine, so, I'm slightly biased. But it's just to give you some ideas about how to push forward these ideas in your own work. And I'm not saying one is good, not one is the other. It depends on the question you have and the way you think about those questions. So I would emphasize briefly the ones we've done, but simply I would emphasize the sociology of science and technology that has been really innovative in a number of issues, even if I don't believe them all the time, but my colleague Bruno Latour and others. And then briefly, Michael Howlett and his colleagues who have developed a program on policy design and policy instruments, but I guess Capano, he's arrived already, will be here tomorrow to present this work. So I will be briefly. Before I do that, I want to emphasize that some people think it's a very bad idea to think about policy instruments. So I will give you a counter-poison to start with. That there are a good number of reasons to think that we should not exaggerate the importance of these things. And I've got some sympathy for that. There's a work done by my colleague Ed Page at the LSE, and Page has been arguing, well, instruments, you're doing all this thing about instruments, but we don't care so much. Most of the instruments in public policy are just routine instruments, and you do all the thing all the time. And most of them, when you measure, are just routine instruments that you use anyway. So we do a lot of work, I would emphasize, on instrumentation, the choice of instruments as an important political thing. But Page is telling us, well, remember that a lot of the work is done in a routine way. And a lot of bureaucrats are not creative, so they just do always the same thing. Okay? So maybe it's an empirical question, whether you have our answer to him saying, yes, but we have a lot of innovation and new instruments, so you have to look at all this innovation. But a lot of work is routine. Never underestimate the routine of a bureaucracy. Okay? I don't know about you here, but in the French administration of Ministry of Education, have a formidable capacity to invent new things, but it's to change for not to change, okay? Just doing exactly the same thing than before with a new name, okay? So I think it's something that we have to keep in mind. Not get overexcited about innovation in instruments. Second is a more interesting criticism coming from a sociologist from the Boudon group, so of beliefs, called Benamuzig. And he says, what these people did when we use policy instruments is always to combine a material dimension and a political dimension and symbolic dimension together, okay? That was the thing that Latour put forward. And Benamuzig said, this is not honest. He said, this is not, you should be careful, because when you do that, you tend to reduce the intellectual level. You tend to undermine the importance of ideas. And you replace a vertical representation of the social world with big ideas by a more horizontal world with bits of practices and things that people do together with some ideas. But you tend to undermine the role of ideas. So there's a strong criticism coming from people who believe in discourses, cognitive approaches, big ideas, paradigm shifts, saying, it's all good to look at the instruments, but at the end of the day, be careful, because it's a way to completely marginalize the importance of ideas. I disagree with him, but I think it's something to be taken seriously. Okay? So Benamuzig with some others will say, well, you say all your things about instruments and rationalizations, but at the end of the day, it's neoliberal world things going on. I don't believe that, but it's a real question. And I think it's something to keep in mind of not undermining too much the role of ideas. A third criticism have come from, I will use Michel Calon later, but emphasizing that It's all good to look at policy instruments, but in fact, it doesn't matter very much. What matters really is what happens in the market. And you have to look at the devices on the market. And Michel Callon and Latour and all this group have developed the idea of assemblage in the construction of a market. And they say that's what is really important. And then you see experiments in the public sector, but that's not so important to look at policy instruments. Again, to keep in mind whether it makes sense or not. And then there's a group of social historians who emphasize the role of actors, the Bourdieu group, but I will not do that too much of today, but it's interesting. So briefly now, short presentation of this 3 research program. So for us, and probably you may have read some of the work, is really to emphasize policy instruments. What is at stake is the power relations and authority when it is concretely exercised. So our enemy, just in a intellectual sense, is just to discuss, debate, are the functionalist rational view of public policy, which is amazingly powerful when you come back to policy instruments, and I will say a word about policy design in a minute. And thirdly, to emphasize that policy instruments are not always governed. I mean, in my governance program, we always ask, who governs? That's easy, okay? But also, how do you govern? Meaning policy instruments. Of course, who is governed, which is absolutely central in any work we do. But also, what is governed? And you can see that some things are more or less governed over time. It's not a linear view, okay? Like I always say, my students study and governments govern. But my students on a Saturday night, I know Barcelona is very different, but my students on Saturday night, not much. The same thing with governments. They govern more or less at different time, during war, massive government. Some other time less so. Some groups are more or less governed. And I think when you think about instruments, it's important to think about a non-linear view of governance to understand what is going on. And some policy instruments, they have a life of their own, and they are not very much governed, and they have some effect and constitute power relations in their own way. So that was what we had in mind, and asking questions about how is collective action organized, how do collective actors work together, how is political authority exercised. And we try to look at all these things on instrumentation that you probably have looked. So thinking about how they are noticed. And what we wanted to emphasize in our work is that the accumulation of devices, bits of instruments at different scale that were accumulated without any goal. And I will mention that in terms of method. Keep in mind, what is striking in a number of policies, not only is the multi-level element at local, regional, national, EU, but also the fact that lots of things are accumulated and nobody cares about the way they're connected. And it's a complete accumulation without any goals and producing an expected result from that point of view. But once in place, they are like institutions, in our view. They represent, they give stabilize the representation of an issue, and they allow for cooperation, and they create resistance and mobilization. And again, I will say too briefly something about that. For me, thinking about instruments is also to think about power relations. That's a constitutive power, meaning, remember Foucault, resistance against is part of its power relation. So when we think about instruments, we should always think, who is going to resist? Who is going to oppose? How the instruments will be reorganized because of resistance and protest. And that's where the research for us is going now on this thing. I still have 5 minutes, is that good? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, that's fine, perfect. So that's what we do. So a very political sociology of policy instruments, and that's what we have published, so maybe I should not be too much on this issue. And again, this definition of a device of technical and social organizing social relations between the state and those it is addressed, between those who govern and those who are governed. This relation is central in thinking in terms of instrument, with some autonomous effect over time. That was the way we developed our research program, looking at inertia effect, at representation, at some theory being applied, and the way actors are going to behave, the way forms of collective action. So it exercises forms of constraints, forms of symbolic power, forms of coercive power sometimes, are likely to influence the behavior of individuals. That's the way we have developed this argument. But they create uncertainty. Some actors, they are winners and losers most of the time, constraint on actors, and often instruments determine what actors are being used and by whom. So as a part of collective action. And again, you can use that in management and in sort of things. And the last thing we said in our program was to emphasize instrumentation, the choice of instrument, as an area of political conflict, where, and you see that expert forms of knowledge are mobilized to characterize, to give form. So looking at where do the instruments come from, but more importantly, how they're chosen is an important way, and it's a very strong criticism. You know, you have a lot of research about this. Economists, for instance, we like to criticize economists all the time, rightly or wrongly, but you know, that's our trade. You have a cupboard and you open, and a rational policymaker comes and says, oh, I want to get this goal, I choose the right policy instruments and the world will be saved. It doesn't happen often in my view. Okay, so that's what we did. We did typology for those who are interested, but I will not do that today. And just emphasizing that sometimes policy influence, so policy instruments, they do not explain the policy results, okay? We have a number of cases where politics matter a lot. So it's an empirical question. Right? So it's a way to ask questions, and then empirically you see whether it works or it doesn't work. It depends. Not always the case. Sometimes they operationalize or they trace some change. You know, Peter Hall, classic, thinking of instruments as one element of a paradigm shift. Sometimes he's right. We can connect to that. Again, they are empirical questions that you just have to keep in mind. Sometimes the instrumentation does explain the choice of instruments, is likely to explain some of the policy that's gone. But of course, we work in probabilistic terms. It is likely to have this sort of impact, but in different contexts, it may vary, and maybe you have clusters where you see these sort of things. So you have to think about method to be able to show this probability. And sometimes the instruments is the policy. Sometimes people agreed on nothing but the goals. They decide an instrument, and the instrument progressively becomes the policy in itself. Okay, so different kinds of result. I want to emphasize, you know, if your work is about policy, instruments don't matter, that's fine. We do other things in life. It's not so important. And one of the results we have in our work is to emphasize again this accumulation of policy instruments. And you know, this is a key theme, I think, in public policy. You may be familiar with the work of Christopher Neal at Munich. And he and his group are trying to trace the number of policies in a different domain. And you have a huge number of policies accumulated over time. And when you have a huge number of accumulation of policies and instruments, when you had something, a new instrument that will save all the problem, you add a new layer in a very complex world. And you know, you have to understand that this interaction. So it makes very difficult the prediction of a rational model of what will happen, especially in domain with lots of reforms and lots of things going on, like education. And we have to think much more in combination of those instruments and their intended effect. And a lot of policies are implemented through the instruments, and the goals are defined afterwards. Okay, I'm not saying goals don't matter. I'm just saying that in a number of policies, the goals are defined on the way or afterwards. And last point, I want to emphasize again, who is governed? Resistance. And you have to see that there are lots of different behavior resisting. And in education, I understand that your favorite interest groups, either parents or teachers, they are very good at resisting new policy instruments or doing nothing with them or doing all sorts of things with them. So that should be at the core of any thinking about policy instruments. Resistance and reception, and that's part of what we're doing. Okay, this is probably enough. I've got lots of examples about that. And emphasizing the tensions and the conflict. So we've done a database on resistance, but I don't have time, so sorry, oops, I'm exaggerating. You see different forms of resistance, from exit, displacement, avoidance, all sort of protest and all sort of forms of resistance that will redefine. And we're trying to think how forms of resistance explain the transformation of the instruments and then the effect on the policy. So we're trying to identify some mechanism along that, but it's not yet laid down. The second major influence, so that's one bit, okay, that's my world. A second group, I think, has done excellent work on policy instruments, is the group coming from the sociology of science and technology. You may be familiar with that. It's thinking about, the obvious one is thinking about people who have done some work along figures, Desrosières, Porter, Hacking, all these people. to think about trust in numbers and thinking about categories, naming, mobilization around categorization. So it's a very important piece of work. And I cannot resist a quote from the late Desrosiers, who was a formidable French scholar. And I think Romuald is somewhere. He was a student of the work with Desrosiers very closely. And Desrosiers was, and you know, all these issues about quantification in all sorts of ways with big data is becoming central to understand and to explain some of these things with instruments. And Desrosiers was emphasizing that you have, on the one hand, quantification, meaning transforming words into numbers with accounting results, performance indicator, policy evaluation, and rankings and benchmarking. This is the first world, this famous book on the politics of large numbers that has been, and I think most of you are doing a lot of work along those lines. And Desrosiers is emphasizing a second wave of quantification, which is changing the instruments in quite a radical way, thinking about probabilistic econometric models with evidence-based policy and profiling individual at risk selected through the frequency of micro-simulation procedures leading to change among populations. So the point I just want to make here is that we are in a different type of quantification going on at the moment and changing the instruments and their effect. For those who are interested, there's the work of my great colleague Marion Fourcade from Berkeley, and she's writing a book called The Ordinal Society. And what she's arguing is that this second wave of quantification is changing the society, meaning, you know, banks are ranking you on whether you have access to credit and housing. You have consumption company, insurance company, not China yet, but you know, you have more and more aggregation of indicators on each of us, leading to very strong profiling of what you do, and leading to consequence about your access to some collective goods and public policies. So the banking is obvious. You know, one day you try to buy a house and you don't have access to credit. And you know, there are some reasons for that. There are a number of indicators before. And this aggregation is just completely changing. And of course, with artificial intelligence and big data, we are entering this world, which will come to education, of course. And the profile of people already, when you select some students in very prestigious program, Oxford probably, Jane, I don't know, you can see that a lot of different indicators are aggregated now. And you can do a lot of things when you want to select people with figures. So emphasizing that, you know, in the world of policy instruments, this new type of data instruments link more to this probabilistic econometrics model and big data, profiling individual will dramatically change, I think, a number of policy. It's entering our world, and we should be careful about that. In this domain, where is it here? In this policy, STS thing, a lot of the work is about the life of instruments themselves and the double life of instruments. Say Jan-Peter Voss, who is a colleague from Berlin, who did some excellent work. And what they emphasize, a lot of these scholars, is that the making of instruments is connected to forms of knowledge. And knowledge production by various experts is a point also Howlett is making, is absolutely central in what happens in terms of policy instruments. So they do a lot of work on trying to understand both the instruments as the result of knowledge production and then as an experimentation, as practice. And they combine this issue of knowledge and practice to understand. So it's pragmatic sociology coming from Michel Callon, but it's a way to think about these instruments, emphasizing the role of policy experts and the role of those who are implementing the policy on the ground, completely getting rid of all, and in a very, not very democratic way. So I think this type of work has become really very important. And the last range of work, which is being done at the moment, is with a group of Michael Howlett and a group of scholars, a lot in Singapore, a lot in Northern America, and a little bit in Italy now. And it's the comeback of policy design. And it's just the opposite to what I've been saying. So this group of scholars, and I'm very critical, you see that, but again, Capano will give you a counterpoison tomorrow morning, is to think about public policy as, you know, political and technical approach to solve problems via instruments. So what they are saying is the way public policy works nowadays in the policy process, what is important is the policy design, okay? And policy design is first and foremost, of course, to define the goals, but to choose the instruments to implement the policy. So you think about policy instruments as the key element of the policy design. It's an old idea of policy design that is coming back. But of course, in this way of thinking thing, you have a classic functionalist bias. You know, these instruments are seen as natural. They are produced by very knowledgeable people. And you just raise what is the best possible way to meet the objective. So the key question is the effectiveness of instruments. So the research about the implementation is just about the relevance of its instruments and their effect. There is no politics, there is no conflict, there is no question about categories, there is no questions about understanding the world, who is governed. This is not an issue. So policy design is about, you know, mobilizing, and I put a quote from Arlett, you know, and basically the logic which is behind is that the policy process is you have rational policymakers, and what is important is that they have to ask advice to the good policy expert. Because the good policy expert, they are able to find the right combination of instruments to attain the policy goals. Okay? So when I'm a little bit provocative, it happens sometimes, I think these people have spent too much time in Singapore, you know? So, because they've been teaching a lot in Singapore and giving advice to a lot of Singapore government. And so, you know, democracy, protest, conflict, you know, who is governed? Irrelevant. Find the right combination. And if you have the right mix of instruments, your policy will be implemented. In which world have you ever seen that? Sometimes. It happens sometimes. I don't know, 5% of the cases. So it's something you should take into account. But it's again, you know, it's the rational policymakers enlightened by great policy expert. I have problems with that, but it's okay.
You're on time now?
Yeah, I'm just finishing on that. Like my conclusion. I don't have time for my housing thing. I just wanted to say something to conclude on method. And the method is an important thing here, how we work on this thing. We've done several types of work with policy instruments. One way is to take one instrument, I don't know, ranking or SAWA, as you like to say. And I've become an expert in SAWA, thanks to you. I had no ideas, but I've come for something today. And you look where it's coming from, how it is implemented, how it is done in different contexts, under which conditions it triggers some effect or not. And that's fine. This is something great being done. I think this is also a moment where we need to do more than that. Because as we see in your papers, in many of those policies, you have much more than that. You have bits and pieces being done at different levels, local, regional, EU, World Bank, and this is not always there. We don't know how to do with that, and they organize in all sorts of ways. So what we're trying to do at the moment is to say, on top of looking at one particular instrument, of combination of two instruments, we have to do more systematic database on, you know, what is going on in all this world, just to measure that, to see where it's coming from, what type of instruments, and then think about their combination over time to show express. So I'm just finishing a research on housing policy in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. And we're showing, for instance, the case of France, and I just show one thing to show you the sort of things we do. We're just writing the paper. Oops, where is the thing? You know, we do all these nice things. And for instance, we're trying to show that in housing, people think about social policy all the time. But in fact, the most important policy in France is about fiscal policy, which is the orange, and regulatory policy coming from the EU. So most people doing housing policy in France, they look at housing policy. And the point is the interest rates at the European Central Bank is absolutely essential to understand what banks are doing to allow for credit for housing. So the European Central Bank is probably the most important actor in housing policy that nobody looks at. So you have to think about all these things and see at different level they are doing. Another example is by scale. Most people look, of course, at the national level, which is important. But what we have seen in our research is that in housing, a lot of mayors and local level, they have resources, and they do illegal things in a systematic way in order to implement some of the policy their own way, and they follow their own strategy. So you have to combine to see at which level they combine, and it's not just comparing the different levels, it's relational. And you have to think about the relations between those instruments and the way we combine. And when I see your paper education, I can see the same problem we have in our domain, is that we are not entirely sure of the connection between what the World Bank does, the national does with something, it is implemented at the level of a school or implemented. So we have to try to characterize some mechanism and think about method in order to understand how those instruments have some effect that may be more or less predicted. To give you an idea, one of the most flagship programs in housing policy in France that was supposed to be competitive, inclusive, everything, sustainable. The consequence was massive territorial inequality and very bad for climate change. But they had no idea that it was combining with something else that led to this unexpected result. So that's why I would emphasize, and this is enough. Thank you very much.
Is this on? Yes. Many thanks for your presentation. I think it's provocative and challenging for us, and thinking about our own research and education, thinking that policies are not tidy, are not linear, they're messy, they're ambiguous, and sometimes chaotic, as you said, and inviting us to think about and understanding governance as a relationship, as thinking how, what, and who is governed. So many thanks for that. We have 2 rounds of questions, so I would like is, Laura, are we going to do with microphone or just, we'll just speak out loud our questions? With microphone? Okay, thank you. So we have 2 rounds of questions, so who would like to raise questions? We have a moment for that. So should people, if someone has a question, do they have to come here to, yes? Okay, so don't be shy. In the meantime, I have a question, and who wants to add up, just.
Less intimidating.
I would like to, oh, okay, that one. I would like to comment a debate we have about policy instruments in accountability and assessment. Because some people say testing children is not good or bad, putting it in a kind of simple way. You have the instrument, but it depends how you connect it to consequences, if it has awards or sanctions, and the ethics and policy, how you combine them. But you can use a test for teachers to have more information, or you can use it, to threat and punish schools. So the problem is not the policy instrument, is how you combine it with other policies. Now there are other people that say, no, the instrument is not neutral. Instruments, as testing children, have within the policy instrument, ethics, ways of understanding education. And as you design an instrument, you have to be responsible of the effects it makes. So, well, I just wanted to state that like, about policy instruments. So we have 2-3 more questions. Who wishes to come? Yes, and also remember that who are listening to us on streaming can also make questions and comments, so we will also read them. Written questions. Yes? If you can please come and just ask your question. And very well, thank you. Oh, there? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for the... Is it on? Yeah,
yes,
okay.
It is.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Tor Sørensen from Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland.
I really enjoyed your presentation and your distinction between the three research programs, Capano and Howlett, and the functional design and all of that. And I would like to ask you, I'd really be interested in hearing your views on if some of these research programs have different forces, strengths, or limitations according to which part of the policy process you're looking at. So like if you think about policy design, what is in the head of policymakers, how policies are enacted, and the relations to those who are being governed. How do you see if these research programs have different forces and limitations in this respect? Thanks.
Thank you. Somebody else would like to?
Do you want me to answer the two first ones to start?
Okay.
So that would be
Okay.
Thank you. Very briefly, on your first question, number one, both are right. You may have some point when you test children and it has no effect, and it depends of what it is combined with sometimes. And also, you're right to say, I would agree that it's not neutral to test children, and that it has some implications on the way you teach, on the way children behave, on their development. Generally speaking, I don't want to take instruments as neutral. I think they are not neutral. Most of the time, you can say things. But sometimes, without being neutral, they are not very important. So there are a number of cases where, indeed, it depends when it is combined with something else. So again, it's an empirical question. So the test is an interesting one because, of course, it's quite a heavy thing to do. So most of the time, I will be on the second thing. But I want to emphasize that don't read my talk as anti-measure, because there's one critical way of thinking about that, saying everything which is measuring a test is bad. And I see there are some problems with testing, and again, it depends a lot on how you do that, for which purpose, and under which circumstances. But as a general point, the idea that the state tries to make the society legible, if you remember the old book by James Scott, in order to improve policy, I'm not against this element, okay? I come from a country where for many, many years, a lot of inequalities in education were just not measured because we had a national system. It was wonderful. We did not measure differences, outcomes, for instance, by regions. So it's great because we only had average French figures. That was fine. And one day we did some measure and we did some tests, and it appeared that we put a lot of resources in regions where you have powerful politicians and extremely high success because professors, they like to teach good students. And in the poorest region, there was the lowest level of resources. So tests are not neutral, and they can provoke a number of elements. But the idea of measuring as such, I think it's not something, I'm reluctant to be in the critical side, tests are always bad, or it's all neoliberal. I just believe not at all about that. Because if you think that public policy might change society, and in some case for the better, and to limit inequalities, you need some measure and some evidence. So it's all in the nuances, who is doing that, at which moment, and for what sort of purpose, and how it is really implemented afterwards. So to answer your question, I think both are correct. It's an empirical question in many ways. But I would not make the link between instruments are not neutral, so we should be always careful in not using them. I think there are a number of ways where those instruments can be used also in a very interesting way. And I'm sometimes reluctant to follow the critical side, because if you don't measure anything, it's very hard to justify some public expenditure and some policies. And the veil of ignorance rarely profits to the poor people. So I think it's interesting to try to see what can be built in policy design, when policies, how you combine this test with something else in order to achieve possibly some results, and how you create coalitions behind them. Because it's not just that the tests are combined with something else. What is crucial is who is behind them and which coalition of actors is trying to obtain. So instruments sometimes depends on the coalitions that are behind them. That's what we try to. My colleague Voss talked about constituency, instruments, constituencies. And I think it's a key dimension to see what will happen between the two. So my simple question is both, answer is both, and it depends. A great scientific answer. But it's empirical work. And in that case, just do the empirics and we'll see what happens and how we can interpret. On your second question, thank you for an easy question. I'm not the best person to answer you, of course, because I've developed my research program in connection, but also in parallel in discussing with those people. So I already mentioned, I think the 3 research programs have strengths and weaknesses. So I think you need to do all these things, okay? Because there is no perfect research program. It depends what you are interested in. I am more interested in understanding how policies will change society. So I'm interested in this relation much more, but some other people are less so. I would say the STS program is a more pragmatic sociology. So they don't believe in institutions. They don't believe in interest groups. Bruno Latour was my colleague at Sciences Po for many years, so he was always telling me, stop with your instruments being embedded in society. There is no bed, So, and I think, let's put it this way, I think the STS approach is particularly relevant when you are in a field where you don't have strong institutions or strong interest groups. So for instance, the STS approach has been extremely powerful to understand new forms of financial markets that nobody understood, okay? And they were able to show that the instrument was the market. There is a famous book on financial markets called An Engine, Not a Camera, explaining that the instruments was the engine of a market and not the reflection of what was there. So the more you are in new areas like all this big data, the more you have weak interest groups, the more you have weak institutions, the more it's completely changing and transforming, the more this question of knowledge, category, circulation, I think it's very, very fruitful. By contrast, in a world where you have powerful interest groups, powerful institutions, accumulation of different things, I personally find it interesting but less fruitful to explain the thing I'm interested in. Okay? So it will be a nuanced answer, but it's a serious answer. So the more we move in a world where we'll have artificial intelligence and sort of algorithm explaining the profile of these people and the needs in terms of education, connected to some NGOs providing things, and new providers of education like Facebook will provide education on the metaverse. The more we enter in this world, the more I think the STS program is fruitful. So that would be the way I would answer. On the policy design, policy instrument, it's a very interesting group and they do a lot of interesting research. Actually, I don't think they do as much research as we think, but what is interesting is that because of this world that you have described in your paper, and I've tried to say this sort of transnational there are more and more groups doing some policy design. So there's a sort of, policy design was not done by many people 30 or 40 years ago. And now you have all these NGOs and foundations and think tanks, and this world has proliferated. And a huge amount of people are saying, oh, we should do policy design and think about all these things. So in my world, I see a lot of activities of policy design going on. So I think it's a very good idea to have a new wave of thinking on policy design, as Howlett has done that. I think it's a very, very good thing. Where I am not convinced is, as I mentioned, is the idea that policy design, you choose the right combination of instruments and then you get the results. And you have rational policymakers. In my experience, that happens sometimes, so you need to do that. Again, it's an empirical question, but not very often. Think about Boris Johnson and education in the UK at the moment. Give me a break, just, talk about rational policy actor. Anyway, so the point is, I like the policy design element and the idea that you combine instruments. I think it makes a lot of sense and it's a very fruitful way of thinking. But what I say, the functionalist view, I am completely unconvinced, and I try to give you reasons why, in particular this accumulation of element and the fact that a lot of policies are not implemented or people resist. So I think a lot of these things, it's really at the implementation stage that the power of the constitutive power of these instruments is revealed and is defined. Okay, but if you are more interested in the policy design and the ideas, I think it works very well. So, different strength, it depends on the questions you're interested in. I'm less interested in decision making, but maybe I'm wrong. After all, instrumentation is a type of decision making. You choose the instrument, so it's one thing there. I'm more interested in the process of so I don't know if I answer your question correctly, but again, 3 different ways of doing things. Look at their work and see whether it's fruitful or not fruitful. You never know in advance. It's called research. So yeah.
Thank you. We'll do the last roundabout of questions and add the questions we have or comments we have in streaming. So, Jaco. Thank you.
Hi, Jaakko Kauko from the University of Tampere. Thank you very much for the talk. I mean, it's really inspirational, and I think there are many things that I would be happy to hear more about. But one thing I started to wonder, and I couldn't get over it, so I would be happy to hear your reflection on it, is the idea of success and failure. And I tend to agree that, okay, that we see a lot of policy failures, and we analyze them, and as a critical policy scholar, so that would be my take on what usually happens. And then 2 things. I'm involved in Paul Terhart's book project on policy successes, and there we analyze some policy successes. So my question is that, do we look enough for the successful policies? Are we searching for those from the in our critical perspective? And then the other thing would be that, how do we see a success if there is one? And then I can certainly recognize the amount of goals in policies or laws, and how they are not being, how they never come true, and then how there is sort of a smorgasbord of different options, and then the policymakers can say that this is a success because we went to a direction of one of those. But isn't it then that we also understand policymaking as a rational exercise if we think that the goals that are set in the preambles of a law, so that those would be the real goals? I would see that there are also other functions or other ways of seeing the success, so that there is some ways of, let's say, keeping the society stable, or different kind of emotional goals, or this kind of goals that Frank Ankersmith would say, that you have the aesthetic gap, which takes out the gives the peace for the policymakers to make decisions and to cover make some sort of a barrier between the policymakers and the public. I'm not saying that that's something that we should have, but just trying to tease out the different goals behind the rational goals. So 2 things: are we looking enough for the successes? And then the second one, are we thinking the policy making in a too rational way? So thank you very much.
Thank you. Somebody else? Last question?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Felicitas from Argentina. So thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm trying to think about this from the Latin American perspective, which is quite different. So I was wondering, you mentioned that there is a less unifying energy of the state. But in education, we do know that the same does not work for all. So to include everybody, we have the risk of constant diversifying educational structures, especially if we take a look at now individuals at risk. So we kind of have schools for individuals at risk. So this from the policy perspective, leads to, in my view, broaden the unexpected effects. Because if you're having like a school for each individual, in the end, the effects you're going to have are like you can count less. So I think that we are here like in a crossroad, because we have to diversify to have them all to have them in schools. But at the same time, we know that if we diversify, then unification is lesser, as you mentioned, and it's the state which at the same time is saying they all have a right to education, so they are trying to unify, but at the same time they diversify the structures to have them in. So when looking at this, I think, well, in the end, all these effects are going to be different, but isn't that obvious that if you diversify, the effects are in fact going to be different? So it turns out hard not to become functionalist, because in the end, you know that is what is going to happen. So it's not, I don't know if it's a question, but it is a comment of how we handle, of how we can analyze this. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question? No? ¿Estamos? Tony?
Thank you, Patrick, for this very stimulating and informative presentation. I am particularly interested in this field of global comparative public policy you were mentioning, and I was wondering if on the basis of your comparative work, you mentioned the Netherlands, England, and France, can you identify different forms of state intervention in public policy and different ways of engagement with policy instruments? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Yeah, tell me if I'm wrong, huh? Stop me, because... well, thank you. Success and failure. You're probably right. Maybe we do not spend enough time to be precise on that, because we tend to be critical, and then so we tend not to do that. With some caveat. Number one, I'm happy to think about the success of a policy, and we have to have several dimensions. First dimension is short-term, long-term. As we know that very well, but the process involved. And really in education, you know, the 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, you know, it's a very important thing. But I think you're right to emphasize that. The second thing is, it only makes sense if you are able to think precisely about the goals that you want to achieve. So why I do not spend so much time on success is, number one, because, as I try to argue, very often I don't find the goals very precise. Or to put it in a different way, there's a lot of competition in the way you frame the goal in such a way that you're not entirely sure what it means. So the meaning of the goals change over time, so that's why I'm a bit reluctant to do that. But, and also, in a number of policies, the real explanation of what is going on may be connected to something else, to another policy or another domain, or at a different level of the domain. So it's not easy to be. So our friends, the economists, they do that all the time. They choose one thing, they measure, and they think. And you know, they manage to do that quite often with some success, if I may say so. So we should probably do more of that. I'm more convinced to think about both small-scale result and think about the aggregation and long, as you mentioned, long-term result on some different. So I think it makes sense, but it needs a lot of work to think about the category of the goals and the term of the goals you want to study. So I think it's possible, but it needs a lot of work. And I think a lot of the evaluation literature is doing a lot of interesting work along those lines. So I'm not against that. I'm just not doing that systematically. But I think it's getting more and more along those lines and thinking, including in terms of different method, qualitative or quantitative, to be able to say something. And the last thing I want to emphasize, as I said before, I'm sort of very not convinced by the aggregate thing, like success of one education system, if you don't say for whom. I mean, France is a formidable success. We train extremely well 20% of our population. Really well. Really well. And we don't care for 1/3. Okay? So, you know, lots of people say it's a great success in some ways, but the average is probably, so I think it's also very important always to think about which groups are going to benefit, and then to think about the general aggregation. So there are a lot of operation and empirical work to be done, but I think you are absolutely right, and I completely agree with that. On the rationality, number one, in public policy, we always do limited rationality. We are all trained by thinking about limited rationality. But what is probably more interesting is to think about different forms of rationality. And you may remember that Max Weber emphasized, different types of rationality. And I think if you do that, there's no problem to think about forms of rationality. What I do not, I'm not convinced is that politicians are rational in the sense that they optimize what they're doing and they think that they will achieve the goals. There are lots of reasons why politicians do things. And they may have their own rationality, which is not about the effectiveness of the policy implementation. It's only one part among a lot of other things. So I'm rather in the idea of taking into account, different forms of rationality in what is being done, including your own interest, your next election, or also imitating, for instance, I think a lot of reform. One of the key mechanisms to explain policy reform is something that is not very exciting. It's called imitation. In the policies I study, the amount of imitation from what is done by other people is massive. And I think one of the interesting results of the STS group is to emphasize how some policy receipts become templates that are legitimate. Okay, like assessment of students, or like a market for carbon in the environment world. Or there are a number of things that become legitimate, and they are, as a politician, if you're risk adverse, by doing things that everybody else is doing, it's, the risk is lower, because if you fail, you can always say, but everybody is doing that, okay? Lockdown, that's a good example, okay? And if you take risk and you take new things, you need to mobilize knowledge, different groups, different constituency. So this is what I wanted to emphasize in this point. On your question on diversification of the school system and unexpected result, for me, I'm unable to conceptualize that. This is an old question in sociology of organization, and I do not see anything else but doing empirical work, because in some case, this diversity is a way to achieve some goals and to really make difference. In some other case, it just creates a lot of unexpected. So from my reading of this sociology, which is probably partial and not enough, I can see it's a core question that is always asked, and I don't see any conceptual answer. I just see way of doing research to get some result and to say something about that. I would add one element to your question, is a question of scale. Because one way to manage what you have been saying is to concentrate on some of this diversity at an infranational scale, and to be very precise on some groups in a particular context. So I think that do urban work, so the question of scaling your intervention and how you play at which level you want to do some things which is also something which is the result of a choice and some political competition, is a very important element. So I always give the example, if you give me 1 minute. In the case of France, one of my PhD did a great piece of research. We have an idea that the more you centralize, the less inequalities you have. Okay, the classic thing. And if you diversify, it's a mess. And all these barbarians from the periphery, especially the Bretons, the worst people. Just be careful. So, but what she has shown is that because of decentralization reforms, people say there'll be competition, it will be bad. It was, decentralization led to the production of knowledge. So we changed the way we collect statistics. And precisely, a number of inequalities became visible that were invisible before. So by diversifying, you also create new knowledge that shows some inequalities that were not appearing. So what happened was, the mechanism was that the regions that were poor and with less resources and very bad result in terms of education, and less resources were able to mobilize politically using this knowledge, and actually decentralization and competition between regions led to less inequality, okay, because of mobilization and extra policies. So I think we have to think not just at scaling, and we have to think about the mechanism that may lead to some transformation, and instruments are part of this mechanism that we have to think in. So that's the way I think we have to approach that. And this virtuous mechanism, they exist in some circumstances, but in the French case, territory, that's strong, okay? And you could say the opposite in Germany. You could say a different story about ways to centralize despite federalism. So I really think that we have to think in terms of mechanism on these things to be able to say something coherent, and under which consequences, under which circumstances some of those mechanisms are triggered, and then we'll explain what is coming. Tony, on various mobilization of instruments and public policy in those three countries, and we've done some research. I'm fascinated by the contrast between France and Britain, and especially the UK. UK is a strange place. It's full of English. It's a very strange place. So it's a laboratory for public policies in Europe. I mean, it's a laboratory influencing also Australia and New Zealand, as I know. So it's an amazing place. So number one, I'd say that the type of instruments that are mobilized are also connected, sometimes in some sectors are very strong, but in some other country, so it's difficult. Sometimes the sector is really the unit of analysis to understand why some instruments are mobilized. In some other domain, there's something connected to the state. And clearly, in the case of the UK, the decline of direct intervention, the rise of competition, all the agenda of the new public management has been implemented long way with long-term effect, and people will. So what I think is interesting is, as you I think rightly emphasize, it's not just look at the circulation of those instruments, but why some of them are chosen, and in some case it is explained by the type of political authority. So even within the UK, there are strong differences between Scotland, Wales, or England, or in France, some regions are doing very different things with those instruments. Sometimes your level of analysis should be the nation state. The type of state that the UK is becoming is actually explaining quite a lot of what's going on in the UK. So the relying massively on market mechanism for housing as some long-term element that no housing is built for poor people and the housing crisis increase. You can show that quite clearly. And sometimes it's more about the sector itself, and some policy domain are very well entrenched, so they are their own dynamics to explain, and they impose their instruments in a way to the state. So I've got three levels of analysis, and we have to combine those elements. So for instance, the housing in the Netherlands is a very strong group and extremely institutionalized domain, so they impose their own logic and they resist what maybe the state might impose. So I think that's what I mean by comparing public policy, meaning that we always have to think what is the unit we take for the comparison, not only just comparing the processes or the actors or the result, but also you don't find the same thing if you compare different local authority, but also the sort of three elements. And that's exactly what we find in this comparison.
Well, many thanks for the questions and this dialogue.
Thank you for
so
questions.
an applause.